This is a reading from the 13th chapter of Luke. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. On the wall in our living room hangs a photograph I made long ago as a newspaper photographer. In the picture, a young woman, a member of the Westminster College swim team, stands in the deep end of a swimming pool in water up to her neck. She is supporting a blonde-haired boy, maybe 13 or 14, who is confined by cerebral palsy. He floats on his back, held in both her arms. His head rests against her left biceps, and he is straining his head sideways, trying to catch a glimpse of the water. His chest is arched high out of the pool, but his palsy thrusts his arms beneath and below him. He could not float if it weren't for her assistance. She is coaching him for the upcoming Special Olympics. Not deliberately and not verbatim, yet in its way, this photograph that I made is a quotation of a photograph by W. Eugene Smith, which he made in Japan in 1972, in the fishing village of Minamata. Smith's photograph is of a young girl named Tomoko Uemura, who is maybe 12 years old and who was born with multiple birth defects caused by mercury poisoning. In Smith's photo, Tomoko is being bathed, and her mother is supporting her in the Japanese bath, which is chest deep and about the size of a hot tub. Tomoko's body is rigid, nearly paralyzed, her hands and feet curved in upon themselves. Tomoko's mother holds her with an arm under her neck and the other beneath her legs, so that Tomoko floats in the water. And her mother looks into Tomoko's face with such love and tenderness that you cannot help but see the person in Tomoko who is there, not her withered and paralyzed limbs, not her inability ever to care for herself, but only her personhood, because it is the person who is Tomoko at which her mother is gazing and to which she so carefully attends. What has gone wrong in the bodies of the children in these two photographs is unrelated, and the pictures themselves were made 20 years and half a world apart. But there the children are, unable to help themselves, held and supported in the water by two women whose compassion and love see through and beyond any defect. That's what the Sabbath looks like to me. Those are the images which come to my mind when I imagine the commandment to observe the Sabbath. It was not always this way. My first ideas of Sabbath were formed by a story in one of my 3rd or 4th grade reading books about some boy my age, either in the Midwest or in New England in the late 19th century, and his Sabbath, which began with a long, grueling Saturday on which he needed to work twice as hard as usual to stock 2 days' worth of wood in the wood box and carry 2 days' worth of water from the well to the house. Then, come Sunday, he sat through a 3-hour church service, a Sunday dinner of cold leftovers from Saturday, and after dinner, sat for another invigorating 2 hours as his grandfather read the Bible aloud to the assembled family before the boy was sent off to an early bedtime. Under these circumstances, I couldn't understand why anyone would ever celebrate the Sabbath, or why God would spend one of the commandments on it. It took me many years and exposure to some very different Sabbath stories to be able to see the Sabbath the way it looked to Jesus and to the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and to the Bible's poets. They see the Sabbath as a day created and set aside for rest, at a minimum for rest, but even more for enjoyment, for celebration, for freedom. Maybe the idea that the Sabbath is for freedom is a little hard to grasp. The fact that God commands the children of Israel to observe a Sabbath and tells them about the dire consequences which will follow if they don't, probably obscures for us the freedom part. And yet that's what Jesus twice mentions in this passage from Luke's gospel with which I began. Jesus talks about freedom. This woman has been in bondage for 18 long years, Jesus says, and not only is the Sabbath an acceptable day for her to be set free, it may even be the best and most appropriate day for her to be set free. It helped me understand the freedom Jesus refers to when I read some of the very earliest Christian commentary on this passage. Early Christians read scripture very differently than we do. We tend to read scripture the way we would read history, assuming that the text is trying to convey facts to us. The early Christians tended to read scripture allegorically, so that the people and the stories all potentially stood for or pointed to something else. And when they looked for what something stood for, they often drew on their own lives for clues. So the early Christian writer Ambrose explained Luke's story in this way. The spirit that cripples this woman is her fixation on the earth. She is gazing too intently at the things of this world. Jesus heals her by persuading her to redirect her gaze, to lay aside her burdensome worldly cares. Jesus frees her by directing her gaze toward God and toward God's realm. I wouldn't necessarily assume, as Ambrose does, that this woman, to make things easier, let's just call her Dorothy, that Dorothy is bent over by possessiveness, that what cripples her is her attachment to worldly things. I think it's just as likely that she's bent over not by too many possessions, but by too few or none at all, that she's bent over by her fear about where her next meal will come from and how she will live. Although it could also be the case that the care which bends Dorothy over has nothing to do with her livelihood. It could be that Dorothy is simply bent over under the weight of the world's judgment. Maybe Dorothy knows that in the eyes of her family and of her community, she doesn't measure up in some way. She doesn't work hard enough, or she's a poor cook, or she doesn't raise her children well, and she never makes a profit when she sells her vegetables at the market. Some of those judgments may truly come from beyond Dorothy, from her friends, and from family, and even from strangers. But some of the judgments probably arise in Dorothy herself, in her own idea of who she ought to be. Maybe Dorothy is bent over and crippled by a sense of her own failure, by disappointment at not having accomplished what she dreamed of and desired, bent over by the belief that she's never taken control of her own life and made something of herself. And if that's the kind of burden that Dorothy labors under, then the Sabbath was made by God precisely to free her from that burden. By asking us not to labor on the Sabbath, God also keeps us safe on that one day of the week at least from our own striving and our own ambition and all of our attempts to produce our own value and worth. By giving us a day to enjoy God's favor and prohibiting us from earning favor on that day, God undermines the very concepts of failure and accomplishment, effectiveness or inadequacy, at least as far as those things become measuring rods for our self-worth. On the day in which God forbids us to labor, we are forced to recognize that our true value has nothing to do with our labor. It comes from somewhere else entirely. That's how it happens that Jesus suggests that the Sabbath is exactly the day on which Dorothy should be freed from her illness, from her burden. He is transmitting what he has learned from the early Hebrew scriptures about the proper observance of the Sabbath. He understands that the Sabbath is meant for our enjoyment and that the greatest part of that enjoyment is the freedom of standing within God's gaze and knowing where you stand, knowing to whom you belong, not to this world, but to the light of the world. Jesus points to the freedom of knowing in the deepest part of yourself that who you are is not what you have done or what you do. Who you are is something more basic than what you do. God's creation of the Sabbath tells us that there is some fundamental person, a person at rest, who is made to receive the goodness of life. And the goodness of life is a grace to be received, not a labor for which you are responsible. While that first fundamental relationship between yourself and the ground of all being may form and inform every task you perform, every labor you carry, every relationship you build and sustain, that first relationship, the one in which your value as a creation resides, that value, that relationship is not based on your performance. It is the very thing, God's ongoing creating activity within us, that is the true source of our value. And even though all our performance grows from the unique creating activity within us, it is the creating activity itself, not our performance, in which all our worth and goodness lie. Because God's creative activity within us precedes every other relationship and all of our activity, our relationship to God cannot possibly be based on what we earn or how we labor. To observe, to seek, to claim the Sabbath is to claim the freedom of knowing that our value arises in our createdness, not our performances, not how well or how much we carry. So other things naturally follow from this particular freedom. For one thing, if we grasp the freedom by observing the Sabbath in its truest form, as a day in which we do not labor, then we also wind up testing in a small way our faith in God's providence, our faith in God's care for us. Because Sabbath time contains within it a kind of subset of God's providence, the part of God's economy which we might call the Sabbath principle. This is God's promise to us that if we observe the Sabbath, we will do in 6 days what others do in 7. We will provide for ourselves in 6 years what others will provide in 7 years. It was the Quaker author Jan Wood who first drew my attention to Leviticus 25 and pointed out the Sabbath principle to me and then convinced me of its reality. And the best way I know how to convey it to you is by reading a passage from her book called Christians at Work. This is a very different account of the Sabbath from the Sabbath not enjoyed by that poor 10-year-old boy who first explained his Sabbath to me. Jan writes, I'm fortunate. I have many memories of Sabbath joys. My grandparents treated Sunday legalistically. You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. They kept the letter of their law, but they missed God's loving intent. My parents, on the other hand, seemed intuitively to understand what a gift this was. For most of my childhood, we were poor. My folks worked multiple jobs to keep us fed and clothed. But no matter how grueling the week might be, we could count on Sunday. Work would be put aside. Concerns over finances would be shelved. There was time for worship and for long conversations about life, God, and plain old stuff. Over came the friends. Out came the games. Long afternoon excursions were in order. Somehow, in this context, I understood, long before the thoughts formed in my mind, that God was for us, that God loved life with us. A God day was a day of joy. When I reflect on things my folks did right, this always comes to the forefront. Sunday was an anchor in a week of delayed gratification. Sunday kept my folks healthy during times of severe stress. And I know that my folks never missed an assignment or deadline because of that day of rest. I love this story, and it's influenced everything I think I know about the meaning of Sabbath. As long as we keep in mind that the relationships we can spend time building on the Sabbath ought not to become one more way in which to measure ourselves or one more set of expectations we're trying to fulfill. Some of the expectations we have about our families and our friends, who we are to them and who they are to us, some of these expectations can never be met. That's why freedom, not relationship, is the defining characteristic of Sabbath. And it's why when I imagine myself into one of those images of the Sabbath I began with, it's never human arms which I imagine. Those two images of the wounded and damaged children held weightless and floating in the water by the two women who see not the uncontrollable body with its spasms and tics, but beyond that, to the person whose created life is of equal worth to any other part of the creation. Those two lives that may never rack up accomplishments, but still hold the possibility of life's enjoyment. Those images have come to embody for me the freedom of being held, floating and without effort, in God's loving and compassionate gaze. To accept the Sabbath is to accept that on one day in the week, my only effort will be to gaze toward God in the way God gazes at me, to gaze toward God in some one or in every place I know of, to look for God's presence. That is the freedom from bondage which the Sabbath holds for me and for you and for all of those who seek that freedom.